Good morning, buenos dias. I am Monica Byrne Jimenez. I'm the Executive Director of UCEA, and really happy to be here this morning because of the people we have talking to us about their work. One of the things that has been really, I guess, powerful about these three studies that you're going to hear about is that they speak to specific elements of our quote-unquote kind of pipeline. And the kind of work that we talk and think about in terms of how do we prepare, support, and then reflect on what it is that we're doing in leadership preparation. So you're going to hear from these three, the members of each of these research teams, briefly, because the other thing that we wanted to be able to do today was to actually have them engage with each other. So how does research around the assistant principalship engage with, inform, contradict, and grant, amplify the work that happens with the principalship? Oh, louder. Uh-oh, I have to be louder. So all of you in front, I apologize. And similarly, how does the research on the principalship, what's the synergy among these three? And how do we make sure that even in our framing of research moving forward or continuing and moving forward, that we do think about these three as being in concert with each other? So we're really excited about the opportunity to have that conversation with the research teams. I think, all three teams were funded by Wallace and the Wallace Foundation, who is also sponsoring this town hall. And I think one of the things we were just talking about that is a real strength of the approach Wallace uses is creating these spaces for research to be in dialogue with each other. And that's what we want to do here today. We're running a little late, so I'm just going to go ahead and start introducing the panelists. Hopefully we'll get Jason and Stephanie up on the screen soon. I think they're there. Hello, Jason and Stephanie. So we have with us today on the stage with us a team from Vanderbilt, Ellen Goldring and Molly Rubin. So Ellen and Molly, who are from Vanderbilt University, that worked on the role of assistant principals, evidence and insights for advancing school leadership. Coming in remotely, we have Jason Grissom, whose study is titled, How Principals Affect Students and Schools, a systemic synthesis of 2 decades of research. And then rounding out the research teams is Stephanie Levin from the Learning Policy Institute, and she was on the team that talked about developing principles, what we know, why it matters, and how to move forward, really focusing on leadership preparation. So it's this nice constellation of assistant principals, and leadership prep. We're going to give everyone a couple minutes, to give you an overview of each of their studies. And then, as I said, we'll have some questions that we've prepared to kind of get them in dialogue with each other. And hopefully we'll have time for some questions from the field. From the audience. And we're going to have to use this mic, I'm afraid, because it's the one that works with them. So Stephanie, you get to have the stage first and talk to us a little bit about the work that you've done in terms of preliminary findings from your project.
Terrific. First, I just want to say how happy I am to be here. I'm here on behalf of my team, which includes Linda Darling-Hammond, Marjorie Wexler, and some others at Learning Policy Institute. So our study combines knowledge from the research literature and draws on our own analyses to understand the elements of high-quality principal professional learning programs that have been associated with outcomes ranging from principal self-preparedness, efficacy, and reported practices, to staff preparations of school climate and retention, to student achievement. Our study also examines the extent to which principals have opportunities to participate in programs with the elements of high-quality principal professional learning and the policies that drive both the development of high-quality programs and access to them. To understand the evidence regarding high-quality principal learning, we synthesized peer-reviewed research that addresses the features of pre-service and in-service principal development programs and their relationship to principal, teacher, and student outcomes. And to understand the extent to which principals have access to high-quality learning opportunities, we analyzed survey data from a representative national sample of principals affiliated with the National Association of Elementary School Principals and the National Association of Secondary School Principals. We also looked at 2 representative statewide samples, one from California and one from North Carolina. And we examined trends and influences of federal and state policy on principal learning opportunities. Through our synthesis of the literature, we found a growing body of research establishing that high-quality principal preparation and professional development programs are associated with positive principal, teacher, and student outcomes. Many programs now provide meaningful and authentic learning opportunities focused on critical content, program structures that support learning, and proactive recruitment. Recent research confirms that principal learning programs that incorporate these elements contribute to the development of principals' leadership knowledge and skills, as well as to positive teacher outcomes and increased student achievement. The literature illustrates the importance of field-based internships, mentoring and coaching, and problem-based learning opportunities. Through these opportunities, principals can actualize the theories they learn in coursework and practice the skills and tasks required of them. Principals' leadership capacity can be further developed with the support and guidance of an experienced expert mentor or coach. Recent literature has also explored programs designed to help principals meet the needs of diverse learners, and studies suggest that through applied learning opportunities and reflective projects, aspiring principals can deepen their understanding of the ways in which biases associated with race, class, language, disability, and other factors manifest in society and schools, and how educators can work towards more equitable opportunities and outcomes. Our analyses of principal surveys found that access to pre-service preparation and many professional development topics has increased for principals. More principals reported having at least minimum access to important content related to leading instruction, managing change, developing people, shaping a positive school culture, and meeting the needs of diverse learners. And access to this content has increased over time. However, while access to important content has increased, access to important job-based learning opportunities, such as internships or applied learning and mentoring, is pretty low. Over 40% of all principals reported having an internship that allowed them to take on real leadership responsibilities, and very few principals reported having access to coaching or mentoring. We also found that program depth and quality differs across states and varies by school poverty level within states and nationally. Compared to principals in high poverty schools, principals in low poverty schools were much more likely to report that they had learning opportunities in a number of important areas and had experienced problem-based and cohort-based preparation. I should also note that principals responding to our surveys reported wanting more professional development in nearly all topics. Lastly, our research indicates that policies that support high-quality principal learning programs can make a difference. In states and districts that have overhauled standards and use them to inform preparation, clinically rich learning opportunities, and assessment, there is evidence that the quality of principal learning has improved. More state and local policymakers have adopted standards for principal licensing and program accreditation. These are important levers for improvement if they are infused throughout the relevant learning supervision and assessment systems. However, few states adopted other high leverage policies, such as requiring a rigorous selection process, a clinically rich internship, district-university partnerships, or performance-based assessment for licensure. Evidence from several states and districts shows that where leadership policies and implementation are strong, access to high-quality principal learning opportunities increases. In some cases, such as Chicago's investments in new forms of initial preparation for principals and Pennsylvania's induction program for new principals, well-implemented policies have translated into stronger student achievement.
Thank you, Stephanie. I know that work is still in the process of being finalized and published, so we're looking forward to that report. I believe we have Jason now. Come in. Awesome. Hi, Jason.
Hi, Monica.
All right.
Well, good morning, everybody, and thank you. I'm here on behalf of the
the team that wrote the principal synthesis, as Monica said, how principals affect students in schools, which was myself, Anna Egalite from NC State, and Constance Lindsay from UNC Chapel Hill. And this report really had four main goals: to detail how the policy and research landscape surrounding the school principalship has changed in the last 20 years, to document changes in the characteristics and context of public school principals, and say who principals are today, and then to quantify how much principals contribute to student achievement and other school outcomes, and synthesize the best available evidence on effective principals' characteristics, skills, and behaviors. So this report was released in February, and I think you have access to it through Hooba, and could get it at the wallacefoundation.org/principal synthesis. I'm just going to spend a couple of minutes focusing on what some of the main findings of the report were. So the big one, or one of the big ones, I think, is that new studies that can really quantify principals' impacts show very large effects. And so we show that across studies, achievement differences associated with a principal at the 75th percentile of the effectiveness distribution as compared to a principal at the 25th percentile is about 3 additional months of learning in both math and reading. And those are effects over an entire school. And we also couple that with demonstrating that there are effects of principals on other outcomes like student absenteeism and teacher turnover as well. And so obviously you don't need to convince a UCA audience that principals are really important. But we really emphasize that I think principals are more important even than maybe we had concluded in some prior work. And in fact, in the report, we say that it's difficult to envision an investment with a higher ceiling on its potential return than a successful effort to improve principal leadership. And so principals really matter. And we hope that these results can be used to justify greater investment in building a strong principal workforce. And the other pieces I wanted to highlight is we asked this question of what matters in the principalship. And here there's a really diverse body of research that many UCA members have contributed to. What we try to do is draw out themes across these studies to identify skills and domains of practice that are associated with more positive school outcomes. And the main finding of this piece of the report is that effective principals engage with teachers around instruction in specific ways, but also that they need capacities that go well beyond instruction, to include those around building a productive climate, encouraging collaboration and professional learning community among teachers, strategic management of the school as an organization, and so forth. And so really highlighting the complexities of school leadership and how we should be thinking about the role of the principal. And then lastly, the synthesis highlights the importance of centering equity, not only in the work of school leadership, but in the systems that surround and support school leadership. So we describe both direct and indirect means of principals to support equity in their schools and try to highlight how school districts need to take an equity perspective on principal recruitment, hiring, and placement. And in particular, diversifying the principal workforce is important for an equity agenda because of the key ways that research shows that principals of color are positioned to address equity in their schools. And so overall, we think the report really argues for this increased investment in principal preparation and support, for orienting principal learning strategies towards specific competencies that are associated with school outcomes, and for continued reorientation of the field toward equity in the school principalship. And I will stop there, but certainly look forward to the conversation.
Thanks so much, Jason. I will turn this over to Ellen first.
Hello, everybody. It's my pleasure to be here in person and to talk about our report on assistant principals. So the overarching purpose of this study was twofold. First, to shed a spotlight on an increasingly prevalent but often overlooked role, and also to help us better understand what the assistant principal role should entail and how to best prepare and support assistant principals. So in my 5 minutes today, I'm going to summarize on behalf of myself and co-author Molly Rubin, who's here, and Marissa Herman from Mathematica, who's not here. I'm going to summarize our results. So finding number one, assistant principals have become more prevalent over the past 25 years. So to give you some background on assistant principals, nationally, over the past 25 years, the proportion of schools with APs has increased from about 1/3 to more than half. Elementary schools have increased in size over the past period, but this increase in school size does not fully explain the increase in assistant principals. Excuse me? Can you speak up a bit, please, for the folks at home? Oh, okay. I feel like I'm screaming. Finding number 2, most principals today have AP experience, but this is also increasing. So nationally, over the past 25 years, the proportion of principals with AP experience increased from half to more than 3/4. And I think really one of our biggest findings is that overall, from 1990 to 2016, there has been an 83% increase in the number of assistant principals across the United States. And just to give you a sense, the number of assistant principals has grown nearly 6 times as fast as the number of principals. And one thing this report shows, which synthesized the literature in the past 20 years, is we do not know why. Now, we do know that many states allocate assistant principals based on size, but that does not explain the growth. So that's a question for us to hypothesize about, especially because we know that schools with assistant principals have a higher percentage of students of color than schools without assistant principals. And as we might have assumed, schools in the cities and suburbs also are more likely to have assistant principals than schools in towns or rural areas. So we know that assistant principals has shown tremendous growth in the role, but we also found that the pathway to the assistant principalship is not equal, and some educators of color and women face barriers to advancement on the leadership pathway. And I don't obviously have time to go into that, but in our report, we explain the nature of those barriers and some hypotheses from the literature about those barriers, and also we discuss the ways in which we as a field might begin to mitigate against those barriers. Lastly, our third finding relates to the relationships between assistant principal roles and student outcomes, and also the relationship between prior assistant principalship experience for principals and student outcomes when a person becomes a principal. That literature is very slim. There are very few studies, but there are some suggested evidence about the types of roles that assistant principals undertake that tend to better support outcomes for students and teachers. And also what's interesting is the literature clearly noted that all principals articulate, about 90% articulate, that having AP experience is one of the most valuable parts of their preparation for the principalship. But interestingly, if you look at the data, state data, and we looked at 2 states, about the relationship between having that prior experience and then student outcomes such as value added, there's limited or very little to no empirical evidence. What does seem to matter is the types of principal AP experience. It's not whether you had it or you didn't, but for example, did you work with a more effective principal as an assistant principal? Or did you have opportunities to engage in particular types of tasks that best prepared you for the principalship? So in short, the report summarizes the literature about the role. We look at national and state trends about movement along the pathway, and we end the report with recommendations both for addressing equity and diversity in the leadership pipeline, and also for strengthening the role. And I'll leave you with a question that we left in the report, is whether the AP role should clearly be articulated as a stepping stone to the principalship, or should it or can it, for some people, also be a very important leadership role in and of itself, and not be viewed as less than if a person chooses to stay in that role? Thank you.
Thank you all so much. And I think Jason alluded to this. You can find these reports on the Wallace website, obviously, but they're also uploaded in Whova. So if you go to the documents section of Whova, you'll find the two reports up there. We wanted, like I said before, we wanted to not start because, Molly actually said that at the beginning of their projects, they were in conversation with each other. So we want to continue the conversation that these teams and the research has had with each other up until now. And I think everyone, talked a little bit about this, and we want to explore this issue of diversity, equity, and inclusion a little more, and give everyone an opportunity to say more about the impact of that or what they found about that in their research. But the question, I guess, is, as the continued emphasis on diversity, equity, inclusion at the principal and leadership levels has happened, we all kind of agree that these are important skills and knowledge and that candidates need to have. And so I guess based on, either drawing from your research or extrapolating from it, what kinds of, how do we get at the disposition question around diversity, equity, and inclusion? How do we cultivate this equity-mindedness that all the reports sort of speak of? This is important, and sort of based, I guess, on again what you found. What would you say that we can do to get at creating that equity-mindedness for school leaders? So I'm not sure if. Jason, would you like to go first on that?
Yeah, I can start. I think mindset is really key because principals are really called on to address a lot of different needs. Those needs are hard to anticipate. And so I think principals really need to develop this orientation towards equity. They need to develop this mindset, or as you said, disposition that focuses them on meeting the needs of all students. And that doesn't mean that they don't need to be trained also in skills for meeting those needs, because I think skills are also important. But I think one of the things that comes out of our report is just sort of the complexity, the diversity of the principal's role, and the challenges that are often difficult to anticipate from day to day. And so you need, if you're going to be pursuing equity, then you're going to have to develop this mindset, this orientation, this patterns of thinking. That you can then apply in these in particular circumstances. So I just want to underscore that I think it's really important. I'll leave it to Stephanie on the how, since she was really focused on support, and I'm sure Ellen and Molly have some things to say about that as well. But I do think that this idea of cultivating mindsets is really, really key.
Is Stephanie, or I can jump, should I jump in? Yeah. Okay. I actually would reframe from our report. I think one thing we learned is actually thinking about the role of central office, administrators, and leadership. So one important finding we found is that APs of color are increasing over time, but yet we know there's so many challenges in diversifying the actual principalship. So we ask ourselves, why is that? And I want to share two anecdotes. One is a quote from a participant in one of our studies. So I have it in front of me and I'm going to read it. And this participant, it was the part of the report where we talk about potential barriers to advancement. And this participant said, this is an African-American participant and female, said, I was not hired. She applied to a principalship from the AP, her AP position in the district, and she said, I was not hired and was not informed, and I was not the right fit. Most of the African American female administrators in our district are placed in high poverty schools. Perhaps this is where we fit. I think that talks a lot about the barriers and the challenges and how there's so many implicit understandings that central office, implicit or explicit, that central office administrators may be placing. So another way to think about the question is, what are the implicit and explicit biases? I'll tell one other anecdote. Molly and I are doing another study, unless you were going to tell this story. Okay, and we interviewed a central office administrator about the challenges of recruiting principals, and in this case, diversifying the principalship in his district. And the central office administrator told me that he was recently trying to convince a Black assistant principal to move into the principalship, and this assistant principal said, "I am a very highly effective AP in my school, and you district are trying to place me in a really hard turnaround situation, and if I'm not effective immediately, then I've hurt my career, which I've worked so hard on all these years." So I just think there's a lot to think about from the central office perspective when we think about these issues.
I think, I have resonating in my head the session yesterday on equity audits and the problematic nature that they can have. And I'm guessing many of you are in there. But when I think about specific dispositions and things like that, I do think that cultivating awareness amongst leaders, in this case principals, about things they need to be aware of as just part of what you do when you're monitoring your data, for instance, and what you're looking for. So maybe not doing explicit equity audits, but things you should always be keeping an eye on. And also districts in terms of what's happening in their pipelines and to their who's leaving, who's staying, who's moving, who's getting sidelined into discipline dean roles rather than moving up, is really being aware of first of the landscape, and then what do you do with that, right? I think was part of the point yesterday. Is it's great to point these things out, but a lot of districts aren't necessarily even following that data, even though they have that data. And I think if there's a certain kind of disposition that we're teaching to the school leaders, it's that part of being effective is doing this diversity, equity, and inclusion work is inherent, and you cannot separate it from what it means to be effective as a principal.
Yeah, and that last point actually reminds me of a conversation I was having a few weeks ago when someone was talking about their, new research that they were doing, especially during the, times of COVID, right? That COVID has had this very, I don't even know what the word, paradoxical effect, right? Because on the one hand, it is highlighted for the system, educational system, for leaders, and inherent inequities that we had in schools and communities and districts. And on the other hand, what this colleague was finding was that principals were sort of overwhelmed by what was happening with COVID, that they talked about putting diversity, equity, and inclusion to the side. That they would come back to that once they all got through whatever through means, but once they got to the other side of COVID. And I think it sort of speaks to both of a little of what you're saying, that this approach has to be systemic, from the district and, the school level and the classroom level, but also has to be integrated into all the work that principals and leaders do. So thinking that DEI is still something you do on the side still seemed to be prevalent. And so actually, I don't know if Stephanie might be able to chime in there about, issues of preparation and development, and how are ways in which we can change that mindset before we can think about other dispositions that principals need to have, or APs or superintendents.
Programs and the in-service professional development can include more content and applied learning opportunities that focus on issues of equity and culturally responsive leadership. And research that we've read suggest that even a single course about meeting the needs of diverse learners can be linked to the development of principal skills. From the research, we know that engagement in applied learning opportunities, such as action research or field-based projects, and reflective projects, which include cultural autobiographies, cross-cultural interviews, and analytic journals, all have the potential to develop aspiring principals' knowledge and skills for meeting the needs of diverse learners. We also know that these activities can prepare principals to foster equitable school environments, deploy resources equitably, support culturally responsive curriculum, and create welcoming and authentic partnerships with families, develop hiring and induction policies that support a diverse teacher workforce. And there are more examples in the preparation literature than the in-service professional development literature, but there are examples of programs that have been studied that show the efficacy of these approaches.
Yeah, thank you, Stephanie. I think the other, as you're talking, and I was thinking more about the question, it also, I think the question I was having right now was actually how these principles framing of diversity, equity, and work is something that needs to be put on the side until other work gets done, may in some ways be reflecting the preparation they're having. And how within our own programs, we think, diversity, equity, and inclusion is a class that happens on the side as opposed to sort of being more integrated. So I think there's a challenge there for us to think about in what ways are we preparing principals and APs and superintendents to be thinking about that work as not something that happens once, other things happen, but that's actually integral to all of their work.
Yeah, you can think about programs that have a class, like diversity, equity, and inclusion, and it's your 3 credit hours, or you could think about how an insistence that whatever these concepts are and whatever you're teaching should be integrated into a course. And similarly, when thinking about the role of a district, you could think of principal evaluation systems and districts tacking on a DEI module to how they're assessing people, if they do that at all. Or you could think that every one of the modules or domains that people are being assessed on has certain competencies that are directly linked to fostering equity in the school environment, whether for students or the workforce. So again, it's I think that integration, and one of the things that the district can do or how they think about, I think we're very much in a time where if you don't count it, it doesn't matter. So especially when people are being asked to do so many things, and if we don't start integrating things, then we will always put this stuff to the side, and we have always put this to the side. That's why we're in this situation in the first place, or we've intentionally not paid attention to it. And so I think that so much of this is organizational beyond just the teaching of the competencies, but also ensuring that it is inherent in every step of the work that is done.
Yeah, and I think, that's been a long-standing question in the field, I think, something that we've been tackling for at least as long as I've been involved. How do you address this work? So clearly it's something that's been highlighted by all 3 of these perspectives. I think, the other thing, the question that has come up too in the work that you all have done are sort of implications for diversifying the pipeline, from the AP position, not just in diversifying that, but addressing, the barriers that you all found to that. And yesterday, Dr. Jackson in her general session also posed an interesting perspective on that. She was talking about a system as large as Chicago, and that one of the things that in the work that they had started to do, and they actually started to explore, was the Latinx representation of principals. And she said, sort of hypothetically, right, that if that Latinx principals wanted to work in Latinx schools, and so if there are 50 Latinx schools, there will always ever be 50 Latinx principals. And they hadn't gotten a lot further into that question, but just the question, sort of resonated with me when you said, Ellen, about sometimes APs want to stay APs, as opposed to thinking about it as a stepping stone. So I would just like to hear your thoughts about that, and how is that something that we need to address systemically, and responsibly and responsive to the needs of the principals and the APs.
Yeah, that's a really important question. And I think so much is about helping principals have those conversations with their assistant principals. So we know the AP role varies a lot, and in the report, we present data about that, and many of you have studied that and written about that, and I'm sure your research is synthesized in the report, hopefully correctly. But there's not one study, not one, that asks principals how and why they assign the tasks that they do, or that how and why APs come to do the tasks that they do. And we know there's great variability. The assumption that assistant principals are only doing mainly discipline isn't really bared out. Just like principals, assistant principals have many roles, and it varies. But many assistant principals, of course, do. So I'm going to come back to your question in a minute about career advancement. So I think if we understand why and how principals and assistant principals work together, what are the ultimate career aspirations and goals of an assistant principal, and how that changes over time? I'm sure it does. I mean, when you think about Fortune 500 companies, and I'm not saying schools should emulate them, but this whole idea about career conversations and career coaching, not just job coaching, may be one way to help think about that, about what are the aspirations of the assistant principals and what types of schools would they want to work in as individuals, not necessarily as just thinking about representation as a group. Lastly, I'll say about that, the reason that's really important in terms of diversifying the pipeline is that if an assistant principal is only given the opportunities to engage in a particular set of skills, and they are interested in moving on to the principalship or other leadership roles within the district, and they're not given the opportunity to practice across various domains and to practice on various skill sets and inclinations, then they may face barriers when applying for the principalship, where others have had that opportunity to engage in all different types of leadership. So just some thoughts about more research needed, but also I think it's very individual, and I think principals can be mentored on how to have those conversations with their APs to support them, whatever decision they make.
Jason, did you have any thoughts about that question about the, sort of pipeline and diversifying it, and what if principals of color are happy where they are?
Yeah, so I did have something I wanted to say about this. I mean, sort of on Ellen's point of more research needed, I guess. I think one of the tensions here is that one of the things that people in the research community in the education research community have been studying is, what are the impacts of principal diversity, in part to demonstrate, what the value of having a more diverse workforce is, to push policymakers and people at the district level to value principal diversity. And a lot of that research, including my own, this is a call to me as much as anyone, has been thinking about, what are the impacts of principals of color, for example, on students of color, and showing these, big important roles that racially and ethnically, principals who are, from different racial and ethnic backgrounds have especially on students with whom they share backgrounds, and teachers with whom they share backgrounds. And the tension there then is that I think, and the research is encouraging people at the district level to think about, uh, you know, as you were pointing out in the session from Chicago yesterday, you know, encouraging the pipelines or funneling of principals from particular background into schools serving predominantly students from those backgrounds. And, you know, this is, I think, creates a real tension because that maybe is obvious to other people in the room, but maybe calls on us to think broadly about the value of diversification and communicating the value of diversification to sort of disrupt these patterns of thinking that I think are creating some of these pipeline issues, Monica, that you're highlighting and that Ellen was highlighting.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's I think it's a fascinating question. You know, how do we get at that? You know, diversifying the pipeline for who and for what, and to be thinking about, you know, the needs and the interests and the career trajectories of principals and APs of color, I think is a really fascinating question that needs to get explored more. I do want to sort of shift this a little bit more conceptually or philosophically, perhaps. I mean, because we use the metaphor of the pipeline, we've been using that language for a long time now. I always struggle a bit with the metaphor of the pipeline. And so I would just be curious in your own thinking about what you know, your participants and what you've experienced. You know, what is useful about thinking about leadership preparation and trajectories as a pipeline? And what aspects about that metaphor itself might be keeping us from better understanding sort of the possibilities and the opportunities that exist for leadership and education in schools?
Well, when we started this work, we talked about the principal pipeline. That was the language we were using. And in our internal team, we very much shifted to a back and forth about talking about the pathway to the principalship. And now in work we're doing, we're much more thinking about leadership pathways. So, and that there are maybe multiple pathways and multiple endpoints, or, you know, different pathways along, you know, there's different ways to get from A to B or A to C. And perhaps one of the problems of a linear pathway with these very clear steps, which the majority of people take to get to, in this case, the principalship, is that for folks who do get sidelined, and this goes back to the equity issue again, once they're off the pathway, that it's hard to get back on when it works as just a pathway. And so I think there is something to be thought about, whether it's a distributive leadership model or other kinds of models where you realize that there's leadership for different purposes in different places throughout an organization. And so I think in some ways it's really important, like this idea really comes from the idea of we have to have trained people who are ready to step up into a role as turnover happens. But at the same time, I think we need to be cultivating leaders in diverse settings, as in lots of arenas, who are ready to step into that and who've had different experiences, because that's also part of this whole diversity piece.
I think one of the big challenges is when we use a term like pipeline, that means many different things. So we might each need to qualify what that means. From the Wallace's perspective, their pipeline has 7, I think their current thinking has 7 specific domains. It is not the way we're talking about it here now as preparation for the principalship or from teaching to AP to principal. So for example, their conceptualization of pipeline has a domain of changing and developing the role of principal supervisors to better support principals, so that's part of the pipeline. They have other parts of the domain, and in our conversations with districts, many districts think pipelines mean having university preparation partnerships, for example, so that they have a group of leaders who are ready to move into their role. So just a comment that term, one of the issues with it, right, is it might constrain our thinking, or we may be talking past each other because different people think it means different things.
Stephanie, I was wondering, I'd like to get your thoughts on that, given the sort of quote-unquote start of the pipeline that your work addresses.
Yeah, thank you. We built on the idea of a pipeline and describe a professional pathway. And our version differs that it considers the individual principal's experiences rather than looking at the system as a whole. And what we add to the idea of the pipeline is additional context. Specifically, we take into account the fact that principals bring many different kinds of knowledge, skills, and dispositions to the job beyond those acquired in formal training. Principals bring with them their lived experiences from their own personal cultural contexts and from the education they received as children and young adults, as well as in their teacher preparation programs, and from the close relationships they forged often in the professional community. And on top of this foundation, principals learn in and from the job experiences they may have had as a teacher or teacher leader or coach or assistant principal, and then experienced principal. And they learn from formal professional learning experiences, which interact with all of these experiences in many different ways. As Ellen and Molly just talked about, the assistant principalship, which is increasingly important pathway to the principalship, can be formally designed and supported to increase individual and team effectiveness, but there's no common approach to this role. And one other thing I'd say is when we consider professional learning opportunities, we look at or attend to both the content of the learning, what principals learn about how to lead instruction, creating collegial school environments, and how they learn, which is the structures that support learning, such as practica, internships, and coursework. And the pedagogies that are used, like to the example that learning opportunities feature application through case studies or action research.
Thank you, Stephanie. We actually have a few minutes, and I could come up with all kinds of questions, but I wanted to open it up to anyone in the audience who might have a question for any three of the research teams, or, yeah, I think you may have to come up here.
Hello. So I was interested in learning how you think about the assistant principalship, given also your research on the SAM process, which seemed to be the assistant principals sort of doing things to allow the principal to focus on instructional leadership, and also how you think about, given that we know more and more from Jason's synthesis and about sort of some of the things that highly effective principals do, are those the things that assistant principals should do, since whatever they want to do, many of them end up in the principalship. So it does serve as sort of a training ground. So just thinking about some of the other research you've done a little more on how you think about sort of the work that maybe most assistant principals should do.
Thanks for that question. So one interesting point we found in our the literature review is that if you look at the more recent literature, it does show that assistant principals are spending more time on instructional leadership than they did in, let's say, the research from 20 years ago compared to the research in the last maybe 5 to 6 years. So I think because of state policy, there is a shift in some states because, for example, in Tennessee, where teachers have to be observed twice a year on average, so then the assistant principals are taking on a different type of role because of state policies like that. So I do think there's a shift. And your question is a question that as I said, we don't really know. So we don't know how a principal thinks about all their staff, all their leadership team, like instructional coaches, student support, deans of student, how they're thinking about the AP role as it relates to the other leaders and the other supports they have in a school. And I think that's just something we have to study and understand, but I think we have to really inquire more about this notion about assistant principals taking mostly discipline, because we have, and I know Jason can talk a lot about this too, different researchers define tasks and roles differently, and Jason has a seminal paper on this topic, like how we divide up management versus instructional leadership, and those categories are very fuzzy. I mean, why is working with students on helping them solve, problems not really instructional leadership? Because if they can focus and engage in their teaching and learning, then that's really instructional leadership. So a little bit of a caution about that as well. I don't know if Jason wants to jump in.
If we could, I'd like to go back to the quote, Ellen, that you shared from one of your participants, the Black AP. Excuse me, okay, that you had quoted from another study. And I did not hear in that quote, and I'm going to ask you if you would unpack it a little bit more. I did not hear in that quote that the AP didn't want to become a principal. I heard in that quote that the AP didn't want that particular position because it was untenable. It's a turnaround school with too high expectations. And I wonder if he didn't feel like he would be supported or given the affordances of time and what he needed to make that change. And that makes me think of, and this is what I'd like you to speak to also, please, is it's not just about getting a more diverse leadership in schools. It's about also supporting and honoring those diverse people and making sure that they're lifted up and that their work is going to be supported and validated. So if you or any of the panelists could speak to that, I'd appreciate it.
Apologies for the confusion. There were two separate anecdotes and quotes. So I read this one quote, and the anecdote of the recounting of the story or anecdote of the principal who didn't want to become a principal is not this quote. So they're totally two separate. So hopefully, does that clarify that? Yes, so I'm interpreting this quote as you did, and the other was a separate person, totally. Thank you. And then to your second point, I totally agreed. There's necessary but not sufficient. And we have so many barriers in the movement into and the recruiting of people into positions. And then, of course, totally agree. It's a necessary step, but absolutely not sufficient.
In another project, in a large district, I was doing an interview with a principal, a seasoned principal. I think they had kind of begged him to come back and take over this high school that was having a ton of problems, including some very serious violence problems in the school. And he went on this whole, he ended up having complaints filed against him by his supervisor for the actions he was taking. But he made this point, which was, nobody in my district who's doing the people who are in charge of doing the turnaround work at the district level, none of them have actually ever successfully turned around a school before. And so they're judging me and telling me how I'm supposed to do this job, and they think that I shouldn't be taking, this is an he said, they think I shouldn't be taking kids who are failing in this high school on college trips because that's a waste of time, but they don't understand the fact that if I don't start to treat these kids in certain kinds of ways that I mean, basically he got in trouble for doing that because they told him not to and he did it anyway. So I think this is really important that when we ask people to go and do this hard work, they do need to be supported. And for the person in Ellen's anecdote from a different district, I mean, it's, why, if you know you're going to get fired in 3 years for not turning around the school, which is almost an impossible job given the resources you have, would you put your whole career on the line?
Yeah, we are at time, but I got a question from the back. Someone texted me. And I think it's a question that needs to be talked about and addressed field-wide. But the question is, what is the impact of mostly white researchers and scholars studying the principalship in the pipeline? Sort of raises questions about, how we have to shift epistemologically and ontologically, when we're different from the people that were participating in our research. And so, it's an observation. You're shaking your head, so, you're aware of it. And pardon me?
We were talking about how we're all white researchers sitting up here and talking about this, so it's, even that is, we were just commenting on that.
However, in all fairness, totally agreed, and it was very obvious to us, so thank you for pointing it out publicly. Not all of the co-authors of these reports, however, are white. They're just not here today, but understandable and appreciate the comment.
Yeah, absolutely. And as I said, I think that's actually a question for the field. Yeah, absolutely. So we are on time. I want to thank you all for coming here. Again, I do want to give a special thanks to all of our panelists, Jennifer, Stephanie and Jason, who patiently came in from their homes, Molly and Ellen for being here with us. I also wanted to thank Chris Thalen Krebs, who is our Policy Outreach Associate at headquarters. Will you raise your hand? Who put this all together for us. So thank you very much for coming. Thank you all for coming. Enjoy your day, and round of applause.